Good evening, everybody. Is that scarily loud? Good evening, everyone, and welcome. We are so honored to have you with us tonight for this special event welcoming Pulitzer-Prize winning novelist and Dayton Literary Peace Prize recipient Viet Thanh Nguyen to Viet Hall Life in the Water stage. My name is Sharma Shields, and I'm the Writing Education Specialist here at Spokane Public Library. Tonight's gathering is part of the celebration of Asian American Heritage Month, hosted by our incredible partners at Asians for Collective Liberation and their newly founded advocacy organization, Asians for Collective Action. Woo! Yay! My colleagues and I have loved collaborating with ACL on events year-round. They truly are such an intentional and compassionate organization, and we thank them for choosing the Central Library for tonight's most exciting keynote address. Spokane Public Library would like to thank Auntie's Bookstore, yay! Eastern Washington University, and the Spokane Public Library Foundation for their generous support. Thank you, everybody. Alongside Asians for Collective Liberation, we are also deeply grateful to the community sponsors, Better Health Today, KH Consulting, Gonzaga University, GISA Credit Union, KSPS PBS, KYRS, Patera Lounge, and Peace and Justice Action League of Spokane. Your support brings events like this to life. A few housekeeping notes before we move forward. Please take a moment to silence your phones. Bathrooms are located to my left that way, and to my right over here. They are spread as far apart from one another as possible. And the codes for the bathroom that will let you in are written on the doors there. At 7 p.m., the rest of the library will be closed, and the south doors on Main Avenue are exit only. If you are parked in the garage, the gate will remain open for a little while following the event, but don't leave your car in there, go to dinner, and come back 2 hours later, because you might not get your car back. And please note that in the case of any emergency, we'll exit from the corner stairwells and not the central stairwell. And now, to root us in this land and in purpose, I'm delighted to welcome Tia Mua, political organizer with Asians for Collective Action. She is also a graduate of Gonzaga University and a recipient of the Governor's Circle Leadership Award. Tia will open our evening with a land acknowledgement and share a message on behalf of both Asians for Collective Liberation and ACA, reminding us why we come together in community and what this celebration stands for. Please welcome Tia Mua.
Sorry, I'm a shorty. I'll just grab this. Okay. Ya rong gulumbe ya Tia Mua, gunia ya maya, gutsi ya vanzar mua, gupa ya Tia Ta, guya ya potan wasu. I just said, hello, my name is Tia Mua. My mom's name is Mai Yang, my dad's name is Jer Mua, my grandma's name is Tia Tho, and my grandpa's name is Mua Su. And so it's tradition in our Hmong culture to not only just say our names, but also the names of our parents and our grandparents to help really root ourselves in our community and help people understand who we are and who we are in relation to them as well. So welcome to this special evening with Viet Thanh Nguyen as part of our celebration of Asian American Heritage Month. Throughout the month of May, we are bringing the community together through art, activism, and storytelling, creating cultural spaces where Asians and Asian Americans can celebrate our histories, connect through shared experience, and feel a deep sense of belonging and joy. This year's theme is Echoes, Letters for New Tomorrows, and it invites us to explore how history resonates within us and how our choices today will shape the world to come. Each echo is not just a memory, but an opportunity. It's an opportunity to amplify what must be heard, to reshape narratives, and to ensure that what we leave behind is not silence, but a symphony of voices guiding new tomorrows. It's especially meaningful to be holding this conversation tonight as we mark the 50th anniversary of the end of the Vietnam War and the resettlement of Southeast Asian refugees in the US, which also brought my parents and my family here. It's a moment that profoundly altered the lives, landscapes, and generations. Viet's powerful storytelling speaks directly to these echoes. His work explores themes of identity, memory, and belonging, offering deep insight into the Vietnamese diaspora and the broader Asian American experience. I want to take a moment to honor and recognize that we are gathered on the traditional and unceded lands of the Spokane tribe of Indians, known in their own language as the Spokane, the children of the sun. We pay deep respect to their elders past, present, and emerging. The echoes we speak of today would be incomplete if we did not also hear of the enduring struggles and presence of our Native communities, those whose stewardship of this land continues despite centuries of violence and erasure. For thousands of years, the Spokane people have cared for these lands, and despite ongoing displacement, systemic erasure, and colonization, the Spokane people are still here, still protecting the earth, leading with wisdom, and carrying forward sacred traditions. So as Asians and Asian Americans, many of us, children of immigrants, refugees, and war survivors, our presence on this land is very complex. We're not native to this soil. We are settlers, even if we are displaced ourselves. Our families arrived through waves of migration shaped by militarism, colonialism, and survival. We benefit from and contribute to these systems on this land. And so we must also carry a responsibility, and that is to walk in solidarity with Indigenous peoples here, to uplift Native sovereignty, and to ensure that our liberation never comes at the expense of theirs. As I said, this year marks 50 years since the first major waves of Southeast Asian migration and resettlement into the US after the Vietnam War and the CIA-backed secret war in Laos, where over 2 million tons of bombs were dropped, displacing millions and killing hundreds of thousands, making Laos the most heavily bombed country to this day. Among those displaced were my Hmong people, an indigenous people of the highlands of Laos, Vietnam, and Thailand. Many were recruited to fight alongside US soldiers by the CIA. And it's called a secret war because, we were not supposed to be there in Laos. Our people were abandoned and left stateless. So 50 years of rebuilding lives, 50 years of forming new homes and holding on to traditional languages, 50 years of navigating schools, borders, and courtrooms, of healing from trauma while raising children with dreams brighter than our own wounds, of turning refugee stories into stories of resistance and renewal. Today, our immigrant communities are under attack. Southeast Asian immigrants are being deported, ripped from their families and communities they've called home for decades. Anti-Asian violence is still on the rise, and yet our people are still rising. We rise with ballots and banners, with food that smells like home, and fists that do not forget how to hold on to joy. We carry that spirit into our work here at ACL and ACA, and we fight for justice, we amplify Asian and Asian American voices, and we create cultural spaces like these where communities can come together to heal, really belong, and celebrate together. And through our newly founded sibling organization, Asians for Collective Action, or ACA, we're building on that foundation of ACL. We're empowering our youth to lead movements, pushing for real legislative change, and making sure our communities have a voice in shaping the policies that reimagine a more just tomorrow. Heritage is not just a museum exhibit or a book on a library shelf. It's alive in the choices we make every single day. It is the way we show up for each other, the way we build communities of care. We resist not by denying our pain, but by making space for it and transforming it. We resist by choosing joy, not as an escape, but as evidence of our survival. We resist by teaching our histories in classrooms that once erased us and still continue to erase us. By knowing that our liberation is intertwined with all those pushed to the margins, Black, brown, indigenous, queer, undocumented, disabled, and working class. So how do we hold on to and carry the weight of all that brought us here when despair feels louder than hope? In a time of despair, we dare to dream. In a time that tells us to fear, we build bridges. In a time that tells us to assimilate, we remember who we are and who we are becoming. In a time that tells us to shrink, we expand. And in a time of cultural erasure, we reclaim memory. This is more than a Heritage Month. It's a movement of memory, a chorus of echoes, and a promise to the future. Our fight for visibility and justice doesn't just end with this 50th commemoration. Today, we are shaping the echoes that matter together. Not just for the next 50 years, but for every single generation to come. Join us in reimagining new tomorrows for all. Thank you. Thank you.
I love Tia. Thank you so much for that, Tia. Can everybody give her another round of applause? She's so incredible. Thank you, Tia, for that grounding and powerful message. I want to start my introduction here on a bit of a personal note before I begin the official reading of Viet Thanh Nguyen's awe-inspiring biography. I just want to tell everybody that I have probably reshared Viet's posts more than anyone else's posts on social media. He is someone whose perspective I always trust and learn from, not just because he is an exceptional scholar and writer, but because he is a true humanitarian who understands the plight of the most persecuted, the most vulnerable among us. Getting to hear him speak at the Catalyst building today was an exceptional experience because I realized how rooted in learning and self-awareness he is, and that is so contagious for so many of us. It encourages us to be self-aware and to learn as well. In a recent post, he penned this sentence: "If we have been victims, what we should learn is empathy for other victims, and to always stand up for those who occupy the place of the victim." It's this keen awareness of the harms being done in the world by our various war machines that makes me a perennial fan of his writing and of his humanity. What an exceptional honor it is to introduce him tonight. Viet Thanh Nguyen is the author of the Pulitzer-Prize winning novel The Sympathizer, a New York Times bestseller, now adapted into a TV series on Max. The novel has received such accolades as the Dayton Literary Peace Prize, the Edgar Award for Best First Novel, the Andrew Carnegie Medal for Excellence in Fiction, and many more. His other books include the short story collection The Refugees, the sequel to The Sympathizer, The Committed, the celebrated memoir and National Book Award finalist A Man of Two Faces, and the nonfiction books Nothing Ever Dies, Vietnam and the Memory of War, and Race and Resistance, Literature and Politics in Asian America. Most recently, he has been the recipient of fellowships from the Guggenheim and MacArthur Foundations. He is the editor of The Displaced, Refugee Writers on Refugee Lives, and the Library of America volume for Maxine Hong Kingston. He has also co-authored Chicken of the Sea, a children's book, with his then 6-year-old son, Ellison. And he also recently published Simone, another picture book illustrated by Minnie Fan. His new memoir, To Save and to Destroy, Writing as an Other, is described as a moving and unflinchingly personal meditation on the literary forms of otherness and a bold call for expansive political solidarity. We are grateful for his voice and art. Please join me in welcoming Viet Thanh Nguyen to the Inwiwiect stage.
Wow, thank you so much for that introduction, Sharma. Good evening, Spokane. It's so great to be with you. My first time visiting this part of Washington State. Such an honor and a pleasure to be here, although I think I'm actually extraneous. I'm not necessary after Tia's speech. That was so incredible. Unbelievable. I don't think I could have done anything even a tenth as moving and as powerful as your speech was, Tia. So one day, I want to come back to Spokane and you'll be the mayor of Spokane, right? Yeah. I'm here to talk to you about every writer's favorite subject, themselves, but also about the power of storytelling and the power of otherness. But in order to get into that, I actually do have to tell you about myself, because those issues of power, storytelling, otherness are completely wrapped up in my own history as a refugee from Vietnam. I was born in Vietnam and I came to the United States as a refugee in 1975, along with 130,000 other refugees fleeing from South Vietnam and tens of thousands more coming from Cambodia and from Laos, including the Hmong people. I arrived at 4 years of age in the United States, and we were settled into one of 4 refugee camps set up to hold Southeast Asian refugees. Mine happened to be Fort Indiantown Gap in Pennsylvania. And in order for refugees to leave one of these camps, you had to have an American willing to sponsor you. There wasn't an American individual or family or church willing to sponsor all 4 of us. So one sponsor took my parents, one sponsor took my 10-year-old brother, and one sponsor took 4-year-old me. And this is where my memories begin howling and screaming as I'm taken from my parents. Now, this was being done for my own good and for my parents' own good so they could have the time to get on their feet and take care of their children. But when you're 4 years of age, obviously you do not understand that. And I was away from home from my parents for a few months. My brother, 10 years old, didn't get to come home for 2 years. And that, he likes to tell me, is how we know Mom and Dad love you more. Don't feel too sorry for him, though, because 7 years later, having arrived in this country with no English, he graduated as valedictorian of his high school, and then went to Harvard University, which is what you're supposed to do when you're Asian. I went to my last choice university. I was a disappointment in the family. We arrived in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, after leaving Fort Indiantown Gap. And this began our journey of Americanization, a journey that was so powerful, so seductive, so persuasive, that I actually never thought twice for decades about why Fort Indiantown Gap was called Fort Indiantown Gap. And as you can imagine, it was called that because the white settlers who came to that part of Pennsylvania needed a fort in order to continue with their campaign of conquest and of settlement. Most of the local people, the indigenous people, the Susquehannock or the Conestoga, had been wiped out by 1700. And the few that remained, most of them were massacred in 1700 by a white vigilante gang called the Paxton Boys. And when my parents left Fort Indiantown Gap and moved to Harrisburg, they began their American dream by buying a house. And that house, as I saw when I looked at the deed of their property, was built in Paxton Township. So our possibility as Americans, as refugees coming to this country, is inextricably intertwined with the history of this country as a settler colonial country. And that's part of the contradictions in which I've found myself, and I've tried to understand for the past few decades. What does it mean to come as a refugee to this country, to be rescued by this country, and then to become a part of the settler history and the settler present of this country as well? So I've written many, many words about what that means. And I want to start with a little bit of an excerpt from a book called A Man of Two Faces. Because what happened after we settled in Harrisburg is that 3 years later, in 1978, we moved to San Jose, California. Thank God. And we arrived knowing nothing about this town, this city, except in my case, for the fact that there was a famous song about San Jose, California, which many of you may have heard. A decade after Dionne Warwick's song climbs the charts, I arrive in San Jose, watch a public service announcement about the city accompanied by her song, and think, this is so not cool. Even if I myself was definitely so not cool. Those who find their way to San Jose may drive through East Santa Clara Street, the digestive tract running through the city's potbelly of a downtown. On a small, shady appendix of a side street, my parents' best friend, Bac Quy has opened the first Vietnamese grocery store. Bac Quy, who never marries, who never has children, and who bestows on me $100 bills for debt. Ma helps her for several months while Ba works on an assembly line. Then Ba Ma opened the city's second Vietnamese grocery store 2 blocks away. That must be the definition of friendly competition. Located on East Santa Clara Street, the store is the belly button of the city's potbelly. My parents call it the Saigon Mới, fusing the westernized Saigon and the original Saigon. Not translating Saigon Mới must be an assertion that we are here because you were there. Not translating might even be a sign of defiance, but I, 7 years old, do not understand this yet. I simply accept that this store is for us, for people who need no translation, yet who must exist only in translation every time they meet the Americans surrounding them. When my brother graduates as valedictorian of San Jose High, the San Jose Mercury of 1982 profiles him and describes Ba Ma's Saigon Mới as a miniature department store, overflowing with bolts of silk and Vietnamese books in addition to Indo-Chinese groceries and American junk food. A miniature department store. Why did I never imagine this humble enterprise of my parents in this manner? Creaking accordion gates protect the storefront, protesting every time they are opened and closed. Long tongues of sticky yellow paper dangle from the ceiling, studded with dead flies. White rice in 50-pound sacks is stacked to the rafters. In the back, a butcher hacks at fish and meat while I stamp prices in purple ink on cans of grass jelly and lychees in syrup. Soy sauce, oyster sauce, nước mắm, and mắm ruốc in a sickly shade of purple. Coco Rico coconut soda in green cans, a machine for grinding coffee whose aroma mixes with the rice, JVC stereos with cassette players in boxes behind the counter, which my parents send home to our relatives who sell them for cash. Why do they need cash? And why can we not just send cash if they need it? My life with Ba Ma, defined by questions I never ask. Under the glass counter are Chinese martial arts paperback novels translated into Vietnamese, which my brother can read, but I can't and never will. I am 8. I can and do eat all the Chinese donuts and fried sesame seed balls I want, as well as Danish butter cookies in blue tins and sugary ladyfingers and chocolate-covered cherries that pop and ooze in my mouth. I have not tasted any of them again since the days of the Saigon Mới. What would happen if I ate a chocolate-covered cherry now? Would I remember all I have forgotten or tried to forget? So I grew up in the Saigon Mới, watching my parents work in this grocery store, 12 to 14-hour days every day of the year, except Christmas and Easter, because they were devout Catholics. It was a difficult existence, as I'm sure you're all familiar with, the typical lore of the immigrant and the refugee who comes to this country. Difficult existence. My parents were shot in their store on Christmas Eve, for example. And I was the accountant. Every day they would come home from work, make dinner, and then afterwards we would process together the cash the checks, the coins, the food stamps, the aid to families with dependent coupons stamps, the women, infant, children's coupons. And this is how I knew that the Vietnamese refugee community, which treated my parents' store as the center of their San Jose, that's how I knew the Vietnamese community was in desperate straits. And lo and behold, 4 decades, 5 decades later, most of those people are Republicans. But I was watching my parents struggle in this store, and I had no way of articulating what that meant, that we were living in a Vietnamese refugee community still suffering from the loss of the war, the loss of their country, the loss of so many relatives and people they had left behind. A community that was still saturated in rage and anger and sadness and melancholy, and who had no way to tell their stories except in Vietnamese, knowing that their children were day by day, year by year, forgetting the language of Vietnamese, and knowing that the American world at large did not care to hear their stories in Vietnamese. And my way of coping with this refugee existence, with this sense that the war had never ended for Vietnamese refugees, was to turn to the San Jose Public Library. I was dropped off in that library every weekend. I would collect all the books I would want into a backpack, bring it home, and read it over the rest of the week. And this was my escape. This was my salvation from Vietnamese refugee life. And it implanted in me this idea that perhaps I could be a storyteller. So in the 3rd grade, when our teacher offered us the opportunity to write and draw our own books, I was ready. Lester the cat. Lester was an urban cat, stricken with ennui. Bored with city life, he ran off to the countryside. There, in a hay-strewn barn, he found love with a country cat. To my great surprise, the San Jose Public Library gave Lester the cat a book award. And I'm forever grateful to the San Jose Public Library for encouraging me and setting me on the path to more than 30 years of misery in trying to become a writer. My poor parents, who are working so hard in this grocery store, hoping that their children would one day grow up to become doctors and lawyers, had no idea that they were raising one of the most dangerous creatures you can find in your house, a writer. I thought at the time that stories, literature, books, libraries had the power to save me. Because they do. I was saved because of places like this. But at a certain point, I realized that if stories have this power to save, stories also have the power to destroy as well. My first encounters with the complexity of what that meant to save and to destroy was through my encounter with American memories of what Americans called the Vietnam War. I grew up in the 1970s and 1980s, and what I soon became aware of was that the war was not over yet, not just for the Vietnamese refugees who lost their war, but also for the rest of the United States who had lost the war too. And I grew up with this sense that the war for Americans was not simply just the Vietnam War. It was a civil war in the American soul that had divided the United States in the 1960s and 1970s and still continued to divide the United States in the 1980s, and if we think about it, still divides us today. So many of the cultural, political divisions that we're experiencing as a country can be traced directly back to the ruptures of the Vietnam War and what it represents for the United States. But for me as a little boy, what that really meant was that I was watching almost every movie that Hollywood made about the Vietnam War, which is an exercise I recommend to nobody, particularly if you're Vietnamese or Southeast Asian. Because if you have watched these movies, some of them are great works of art, undoubtedly. But many of them, all of them perhaps, depend upon the erasure, the distortion, the stigmatization of Vietnamese people. And so for me, the first times I encountered versions of myself outside of the Vietnamese refugee community were through American novels of the Vietnam War and through Hollywood's Vietnam War movies, in which the versions of the Vietnamese people that I saw had almost no relationship to the Vietnamese people that I knew. And that scarred me very deeply. So at a very young age, my father, who was very tech advanced for his time, brought home this really cutting-edge device called a VCR. And I started to watch movies on this VCR. I watched Star Wars, Bruce Lee movies, and then I watched Apocalypse Now. And when I watched Apocalypse Now, I was perhaps 11 or 12 years of age, and I loved American war movies, loved John Wayne movies. And when I watched American war movies, I was rooting for the Americans. And when I was watching Apocalypse Now, I was rooting for the American soldiers up until the moment they massacred Vietnamese civilians. And at that point, I was split in two. Was I the American doing the killing, or was I the Vietnamese being killed? And at 11 or 12 years of age, I had no idea how to put this into words. So I just put that scene away, didn't think about it again until I went to school at the University of Communists at Berkeley. Stepped foot on the Berkeley campus, inhaled the marijuana, and was immediately radicalized as an Asian American. And in one of my classes, Asian American film, the professor asked us to recount a movie scene that had been important to us. And unbidden, that scene from Apocalypse Now, the scene of the massacre, comes immediately to mind. I recount the scene in front of my class, and I find myself shaking in rage and anger. And that was the moment I understood the full complexity of the power of stories, that they had split me in two, not just saved me, but split me in two. And I've spent decades trying to make sense of that power of those stories. And so when I finally did become a fiction writer after 30 years of misery and wrote a novel called The Sympathizer, I thought, here's my chance to take revenge on Hollywood. So, for those of you who haven't read The Sympathizer, shame on you. It is about a communist spy, part French, part Vietnamese, in the South Vietnamese army, a man of two faces, whose task it is at the end of the war to flee with the South Vietnamese army to the United States and spy on their efforts to take their country back, all based on things that really happened. But along the way, once he gets to the United States, he has to get a job, and one of the jobs that he gets is to be the authenticity consultant on the making of a movie that looks suspiciously like Apocalypse Now, but is actually a compendium of all of the United States movies about the war in Vietnam. So he has to go meet the famous director of this movie, who's known only as the auteur. And he has read the screenplay that the auteur has written. It's called The Hamlet, and it is about American Green Berets who have to go to South Vietnam and train the ethnic minorities, the so-called montagnards, to defend themselves against communism and to fight for freedom and democracy. So here we go. My meeting with the auteur had gone on for a while longer, mostly in a more subdued fashion, with me pointing out that the lack of speaking parts for Vietnamese people in a movie set in Vietnam might be interpreted as cultural insensitivity. Do you not think it would be a little more believable, I said, a little more realistic, a little more authentic for a movie set in a certain country, for the people in that country to have something to say, instead of having your screenplay direct, as it does now, cut to villagers speaking in their own language? Do you think it might not be decent to let them actually say something instead of simply acknowledging that there is some kind of sound coming from their mouths? Could you not even just have them speak a heavily accented English? You know what I mean? Ching-chong English? Just to pretend they are speaking in an Asian language that somehow American audiences can strangely understand? The auteur grimaced and said, "Very interesting. Great stuff. Loved it. But I had a question." What was it? I asked, "How many movies have you made?" "None." "Isn't that right? None. Zero. Zilch. Nada. Nothing. And however you say it in your language. So thank you for telling me how to do my job. Now get the hell out of my house and come back after you've made a movie or two. Maybe then I'll listen to one or two of your cheap ideas." Since The Sympathizer came out, I've spoken to many Hollywood people, and none of them dispute this characterization. I confess to being angry with the auteur, but was I wrong in being angry? This was especially the case when he acknowledged he did not even know that montagnard was simply a French catch-all term for the dozens of Highland minorities. What if, I said to him, I wrote a screenplay about the American West and simply called all the natives Indians? You'd want to know whether the cavalry was fighting the Navajo or Apache or Comanche, right? Likewise, I would want to know, when you say these people are montagnards, whether we speak of the Brou or the Nung or the Tay. "Let me tell you a secret," the auteur said. "You ready? Here it is. No one gives a shit." He was amused by my wordlessness. To see me without words is like seeing one of those Egyptian felines without hair, a rare, not necessarily desirable occasion. How could I be so dense? How could I be so deluded? I naively believed that I could divert the Hollywood organism from its goal, the simultaneous lobotomization and pickpocketing of the world's audiences. Hollywood did not just make horror movie monsters, it was its own horror movie monster, smashing me under its foot. I had failed, and the auteur would make the Hamlet as he intended, with my countrymen serving merely as raw material for an epic about white men saving good yellow people from bad yellow people. I pitied the French for their naivete in believing they had to visit a country in order to exploit it. Hollywood was much more efficient, imagining the countries it wanted to exploit. I was maddened by my helplessness before the auteur's imagination and machinations. His arrogance marked something new in the world, for this was the first war where the losers would write history instead of the victors, courtesy of the most efficient propaganda machine ever created, with all due respect to Joseph Goebbels and the Nazis, who never achieved global domination. Hollywood's high priest understood innately the observation of Milton's Satan, that it was better to rule in hell than serve in heaven, better to be villain, loser, or anti-hero than virtuous extra, so long as one commanded the bright lights of center stage. In this forthcoming Hollywood trompe-l'oeil, all the Vietnamese of any side would come out poorly, herded into the roles of the poor, the innocent, the evil, or the corrupt. Our fate was not to be merely mute. We were to be struck dumb. So, you might be asking yourself at this moment, after you critiqued Hollywood so much, why did you sell your book to Hollywood? Fair question, very fair question. Let me try to answer it. Money. Okay, that's the Short answer. I was thinking about how, when I was growing up as a little boy in San Jose, California, on the one hand, I was reading Charles Dickens and Jane Austen and the Romantic and Victorian poets, and I loved all of that stuff. None of that was meant for me as a Vietnamese refugee boy. And yet, in the library, I found this universal experience with literature and with storytelling that saved my life. And then I was watching these movies that destroyed me. And so I was thinking, if we make this book into a TV series, maybe out there will be some young person, Vietnamese or otherwise, who would watch this TV series and think, wow, there is actually a story about Vietnamese people with Vietnamese actors speaking the Vietnamese language, telling some versions of Vietnamese stories. And that young person could feel that they've learned something about the Vietnam War, or they could feel that if they're an artist or a writer, that they don't have to write or tell stories about the Vietnam War. And so that is worth $135 million, yes. I didn't see most of that money, by the way. I think Robert Downey Jr. saw most of that money. I didn't see very much of it. But you know, in order to make this TV series, I knew very well the pitfalls of what could happen in Hollywood to a writer. And it was really important then for me, as someone who was involved in the making of the TV series, to make sure we picked the right people. And so the producer who optioned this book, Neve Fitchman, is Canadian. He's also a white man, but the Canadian part offsets the white maleness. And then, as we know now, right? And then the head writer, Don McKellar, his friend, also a white male, but also Canadian. Good. I knew Americans would screw me if I sold my book to Hollywood. So Canadians are involved. And then through Don's connections to a Korean director named Park Chan-wook, we got Park Chan-wook involved. And if you know anything about him, he's one of the two most important Korean directors in the world, in my opinion. And his movie Old Boy was a huge influence on The Sympathizer. And when Park Chan-wook was asked, why did you want, as a Korean, want to adapt a Vietnam War book? He said, well, I'm Korean. There was something called the Korean War. We're familiar with American imperialism. And that was the answer I expected from him and why I wanted to work with him, and very much why I became a writer. I became a writer certainly because I believed in the power of literature and art to save and to destroy, and certainly because I believed in what John Keats said, truth is beauty and beauty truth, and that's what art is supposed to do. But I also believed in the power of literature and art to endow us, to encourage us to be empathetic, to believe in the possibilities of solidarity, of our connection with people who are not like us, whether it's our mother and father, the others who are right next to us, the others in our own family, the others in our community, or the others across the border. And my work, I think, has always been geared in that direction. So, as Tia mentioned, the 50th anniversary of the end of the American war in Vietnam just happened on April 30th, an anniversary I really dreaded because I knew how many calls I would get from magazines, newspapers, TV stations wanting to talk to me, a professional Vietnamese. And I knew what they wanted me to talk about, the tragedy of the war in Vietnam and how it affected Vietnamese people. I've spent so much of my life talking about that, so much of my career as a writer, but I wasn't interested in talking about that. Because what I was interested in was not looking to the past at this 50th anniversary, but looking to the present and looking to the future and asking, if we are willing to commemorate this 50th anniversary, what kinds of questions are we asking? What are we remembering? What are we forgetting? Now, I know that you in this audience, I can look around, are of a certain generation or generations. Many of you remember the war. I'm a professor. Most of my students are born after 9/11. They haven't even seen America's movies about the Vietnam War. The Vietnam War is history to them, which, when we talk about history to Americans, is ancient history. And maybe there's this sense that the Vietnam War for Americans was a bad war, right? But I think even that memory is fading. Because if we look at what happened in the aftermath, and we talk about what lessons has the United States learned from the Vietnam War, I would argue that this country has learned exactly the wrong lessons from the Vietnam War. I've read, I think, pretty much every speech that American presidents have made after the end of the Vietnam War. And it doesn't matter whether they're Democrats or Republicans. They all say the same thing. This was a noble, if flawed, war. Jimmy Carter, 1977, said of this war, this was a war of mutual destruction. That is factually not true, but that is what Americans want to believe. A war of mutual destruction. 58,000 plus Americans died in this war. It's a tragedy. 3 million Vietnamese people died. Hundreds of thousands of Cambodians, Lao, and Hmong people died during the years of the war. In the immediate aftermath of the war, 1.7 million Cambodians died under the Khmer Rouge, a direct consequence of the war and our carpet bombing campaign in Cambodia. Tens of thousands more would die in the re-education camps of Laos and of Vietnam. Tens of thousands more would die fleeing as refugees by boat or on foot. It was not a war of mutual destruction, but that is how Americans as a whole have chosen to commemorate it, which is how, a few years after the end of the war in Vietnam, Ronald Reagan was able to give a speech in 1983 that said, the Cold War and the war against communism has gone now from Laos to Central America. And the new front of the Cold War and the war against communism is in El Salvador. I bring it up because in February, I went to El Salvador. And I was there on exactly the same day that Marco Rubio was in town to sign the agreement with President Bukele of El Salvador to arrange the prison that would then hold the people that we have been sending to El Salvador. I was there to investigate the history of massacres in El Salvador during El Salvador's civil war, in which we, as the United States, were sponsoring and training the Salvadoran military that committed about 90% of the atrocities in a civil war that killed 80,000 Salvadorans, and which would set the background for the unrest and the disruption that would lead to many Salvadorans fleeing to the United States as refugees, some of whom would become gangsters, some of whom would then be deported by President Clinton during his administration, who would then go back to El Salvador and be among the gangsters who terrorized the Salvadoran population and created the conditions for President Bukele to suspend the rule of law and to send 80,000 people into his prisons, many of whom were not actually gangsters, and which then sets the stage for Marco Rubio to come to San Salvador. Do you see how all this history is connected? The Vietnam War is not simply the Vietnam War. The Vietnam War is part of a much longer history of our reality as Americans to wage perpetual war since the very origins of this country. And because we learned the wrong lessons from the Vietnam War, that's how we ended up invading Iraq and Afghanistan and supporting Israel in what I would call a genocidal attack on Gaza. Now, you can imagine that when I say these things, I'm not a very popular person. The Sympathizer, for example, was written to offend everybody, and it succeeded. I get hate mail from Americans saying, love it or leave it. Go back to Vietnam, you commie. And then the communist government thinks I'm an anti-communist. That's why we still can't publish The Sympathizer in Vietnamese in Vietnam. And when we shot the TV series, despite our best efforts, we could not shoot in Vietnam. Now, you can shoot Kong, Skull Island in Vietnam, but we had to go to Thailand to shoot The Sympathizer. And then the South Vietnamese, my Vietnamese fellow refugees, I was on tour for A Man of Two Faces in the fall of 2023, and this young woman stands up. She's Vietnamese American, and she says, I'm a fan of your work, but in my family, my parents' household, you are the most hated person after Joe Biden. I think the point of this is that if we are committed to the beauty and the truth of art, and if we're committed to the power of literature and art to save and to destroy, we have to be willing to offend people in order, with the hope that we can also have dialogues and conversation as well. That's why I accepted an invitation 7 or 8 years ago to go to West Point to talk to the plebes of West Point. The plebes are the entire first-year cadet corps. It's like 1,000 cadets. I was terrified. I was like, I'm going to be the weakest person in this room. I was. And I went in there and I gave them some very similar comments to what I gave to you, because I believe it's important to speak the truth, especially to people who are not like us. And I ended my talk to the West Point plebes by saying, this is a country, the United States, of beauty and brutality. The beauty is everything that we all know: the liberty, the equality, the opportunity, the democracy, all beautiful things that I have benefited from, but not everybody has benefited from in this country, from its very origins. The beauty in this country has been made possible by the brutality, by the origins of the country in colonization, genocide, enslavement, and perpetual war. That contradiction, the beauty and the brutality, is not unique to the United States, but it is our contradiction as Americans, as people who live in this country. And we have to confront it, even if it unsettles us, even if it makes us uncomfortable. So I'm going to end by talking briefly about this book, To Save and to Destroy, the most recent book that just came out, Writing as an Other. And, you know, these are the Harvard Norton Lectures. I don't know how many of you know what the Norton Lectures are or even care. I had no idea what the Norton Lectures were until I got the invitation. But when I got that letter from Harvard, I was like, oh my God, I knew I was going to accept that invitation. You know why? Because I'm a model minority. I'm a good student. When Harvard invites you, a model minority, you gotta go. I didn't want to do it. But then I looked at the list of people who've given these Norton Lectures. They include T.S. Eliot, Jorge Luis Borges, Italo Calvino, Umberto Eco, and the last writer to give the Norton Lectures, Toni Morrison. I was like, when I got that letter, I was like, you got the wrong guy. This is a case of mistaken identity. And that's true, because when I was going to school at Berkeley, there weren't very many Vietnamese American English majors. But the one other Vietnamese American English major was named Viet Thanh Nguyen too. So I'm used to being a man of two faces, used to a sense of my duality, used to feeling like an imposter, like I don't belong in this country fully as an American. I don't belong in Berkeley. I certainly don't belong at Harvard. But that's why I felt I had to accept that invitation, because here was my chance to go to Harvard and to be a refugee in this space of Harvard. Harvard, the space of truth and light, so powerful that Donald Trump wants to destroy it. And for those of us who are opposed to the Trump administration, I think our reaction might be, we have to defend Harvard, right? And we do. But we also have to remember, Harvard invented napalm. Can we embrace that contradiction? Yeah. So that's why I want to go to Harvard. Because what the Norton Lectures really represent is the power of the canon, the consecration. By canon, there's both a religious meaning to that, but also a secular meaning, an artistic meaning. Once you are in the canon, you are immortal. And this is very seductive for writers. We have very weak egos. Okay, oh my God, you're gonna put me in the canon, okay? But then I thought about how the processes of colonization always involve the canon. Actual canons, of course, but also the notion of the canon, of civilization. Because colonizers know they can't say when they go to someone else's country, we're going to rape and pillage you. You can't say that. Not politically acceptable. Colonizers have to say, we're going to bring you civilization and culture and Christianity. And if you can't accept those things, we'll kill you. That's the power of the canon. That's why I wanted to go to Harvard and to give these lectures. And I did not plan on doing so, but the third lecture turned out to be about Palestine. Man of Two Faces comes out on October 5th. I'm on book tour. October 7th happens. October 15th or so, maybe even sooner, I sign a letter along with 750 other writers, which you can find still today in the London Review of Books online. It's a letter that asks for a ceasefire. It's a letter that says it is a human tragedy to kill civilians of any background, but it is also a situation in which Palestinians are being disproportionately killed. It is also a situation in which we have to restore humanitarian aid to Gaza. It is as if this letter could be written today. I got in trouble for signing that letter, and also for posting it on Instagram and saying that just recently, one of the Israeli ministers described Palestinians as human animals. And that triggered me, because I knew exactly what he meant by human animals. Because in every situation of colonization, the colonized are the human animals in the eyes of the colonizer. Because if you're a human animal, then you're vulnerable for extermination. That's exactly what that Israeli minister meant. And as someone who is a colonized person, I responded to that very viscerally. And I said, count me among the human animals. That is the power, I think, of literature and art to save and to destroy. If we're not aware of that power, we can use that power to destroy others. If we're aware of that power, we can use that power to save others, to save ourselves, through the spirit of solidarity. I extend that feeling of solidarity to all of you in this communal space of the public library, where we can celebrate the power of stories to save all of us. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Spokane. Woo. Awesome. Thank you so much. Thank you, thank you. Now comes my favorite part of the evening, where I get to play Phil Donahue. I know that joke would land with you, like most of you are old enough to remember Phil Donahue, right? Yeah. That means that we have time for some questions and answers, I think like 25 minutes or so. I'm gonna go out there with this microphone. And all you have to do is raise your hand and ask a question. Ask a question. Please try to keep it to 1 minute or less. Anybody want to go first? Yes.
What do you see as a future for us humans?
Oh, wow. Okay. In fact, I have written about this in Nothing Ever Dies, Vietnam and the Memory of War, in which I say, again, going to this notion of our contradictions and our dualities as human beings, that notion of saving and destroying, I say in that book, thinking about the Vietnam War and what happened in Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos, and how that's connected to American history, going back to our origins, I said that we as human beings have the capacity to both destroy ourselves and save ourselves at the same time. We have nuclear weapons, we have this global capitalist machinery that's destroying the environment and everything. We're capable of destroying ourselves. But we have religion, we have philosophy, we have all the ideas we actually need to save ourselves. But are we willing to study them, to learn them, to implement them? That's the difficulty. In some ways, it's easier to destroy than it is to create. But the lesson of this library of art, of literature, is that the act of creation is what brought us into being, but it's also the act that if we paid attention to it, could save us as well. Did I do okay answering that question?
It was very profound then I wonder, what can we do in a situation where we feel there's, in this country, mass insanity?
I don't think there's mass insanity. I mean, if we put it that way, then it seems like everybody belongs in Arkham Asylum or something like that. I don't think it's mass insanity. I think, like I said, I try to present sort of a historical picture of why we're here where we are today. It's not mass insanity. Going back to the notion of beauty and brutality, what we have is a country that has a tradition of enlightenment, of philosophical possibility that creates our institutions, and we also have a settler colonial tradition and reality in which we exterminate people. And that impulse has not gone away. So it's not insanity. The people who are trying to, I think, bring us back to the 19th century, to the era of Andrew Jackson and so on, they're not insane. They are very rational. This is where their power lies. They want to be in a time period where there is no such thing as the restraint of civil rights, the restraint of various amendments, so that people can be exterminated or incarcerated or deported at will. And for everybody who's shocked about this today, why are you shocked? We've done this throughout our entire history. There is nothing new, in some senses, about what's happening today, right? So if we actually knew our history, we might be better prepared to confront our reality and understand that it's not insanity, it's complete rationality for a certain part of the American population. Another question, yes?
I'm just curious if you've had the opportunity to travel back to Vietnam and what your impressions were.
I went back to Vietnam for the first time in 2002 as a tourist, and let me tell you, it's a very good experience. It's still a very affordable country then and now, I think. A beautiful country. It's always been beautiful, but it's more and more with every year, every decade developed as a tourist economy. So if you go as an American, I can't tell you how many times I've had Americans say to me, I was really scared of going to Vietnam because I don't know what Vietnamese people are going to say about me as an American. And really, most Vietnamese don't care about that part. I mean, the overwhelming majority of this 100 million population was born after the war. It is officially a communist country. There is a communist party in control. If you express political opinions that the party does not like, you could be in danger. But if you go as a tourist, what you discover that it's mostly a capitalist society for the most part, right? And then I went back in 2004 to study Vietnamese for 7 months, and I was really good at studying Vietnamese if what that means is drinking a lot in bars. My Vietnamese got much better after several, beers. And the reason I went back in 2004 to study Vietnamese was because I wanted to communicate better with my parents, and because I came at 4 years of age, speaking fluent Vietnamese, and then 30 or 40 years later, I was still fluent in Vietnamese at a 4-year-old level. So when I go back to Vietnam now, after many months of studying Vietnamese, I say, your Vietnamese is so good for a Korean. Yeah. And so I've been back many times after that to study, unfortunately, or fortunately, the devastating history of the war and its aftermath. So most of you will go and you'll go to the bars and nightclubs and beaches and resorts. It's fabulous. I went back to look at the cemeteries and the battlefields and the memorials and the unmarked sites of tragedy and massacre for the purposes of writing The Sympathizer and Nothing Ever Dies. Also for meeting this part we didn't get into, but my sister, who might have left my sister behind. As well. And that's a part of that unended history of the war that affected my family, but it's true for so many other Vietnamese refugee families as well that were divided, that had left people behind. And then I haven't been back since 2014. In 2014, I wrapped up The Sympathizer. In 2015, we published it. And then, of course, we can't translate it. We can't publish it in Vietnam. So I've always felt a little ambivalent about returning to a country that won't publish most of my works. I would love to, though, because the pictures that I'm seeing on Facebook are incredible of how much the country has changed just in the last decade. So I encourage all of you to go. Yes.
I'm sorry, I just wanted to confirm one thing for a second. You mentioned you weren't able to write in Vietnamese, right?
I do not write in Vietnamese.
Okay. So I'm speaking as someone who can understand the language that my parents speak, but I can't speak it back to them well, probably at a 2-year-old level. So I think that my question is largely about in terms of language sometimes being used as sort of like a tool for imperialism in a way to sort of stifle the culture that they're, suppressing, to have your works written only in English, does it ever feel like there are elements that you're not able to speak about in the same way that you may be able to like a translation or anything like that? Or do you feel like you've always been speaking in English and so now this is just the best way to communicate?
Profound question, no, because, oh, you didn't hear it? Okay. So, the question is about me writing in English instead of Vietnamese, and do I feel like I've lost anything, or am I missing anything because I'm writing in English instead of Vietnamese? It's actually a question that's been applied to all kinds of colonized writers, right? Many people have written about this problem. I go back to Caliban in Shakespeare's The Tempest. Caliban says, to his master Prospero, you've taught me your language, and my profit on it is I know how to curse. And if you read my work, I curse a lot. But that parable of Prospero and Caliban and the master's tongue, the master's language, is profound. Because what does it say? It means that those of us who are colonized have no choice but to write in the colonizer's language. Because the opposite demand, this idea that if somehow I'm from Vietnam, therefore I should write in Vietnamese, this is an assumption based on this idea that nations are homogenous. They're one thing. And if you're born someplace, you are of that place forever and in perpetuity. That's a very seductive and powerful notion, and it's also really dangerous. Those notions of authenticity can save us, and they can destroy us. Because once you've done that, once you've said, this person from this country has to speak this language, or that person is not of this country, what have you done? You've set up a distinction between one part of the population and another part of the population. And this part of the population is inauthentic for whatever reason, including not speaking a certain language. And then what happens? You've set up the conditions for segregation, marginalization, demonization, mockery, and in the worst instances, extermination. So I do not trust the basis of your question. I'm not criticizing you. I'm just saying it's a common question because it's based on the notion of authenticity. And I grew up being reminded constantly that I was inauthentic. Vietnamese people would look at me like, you don't speak enough Vietnamese. You're not really Vietnamese. And I'm like, how do you define that? How is that any different than Americans saying this person's not American or that person's not American because they're brown or they're Muslim or they speak Spanish or whatever? So if you have felt the sting of inauthenticity, what you should not do is run to authenticity. You should embrace, I say this in one of my books, I'm authentic to my own inauthenticity. That to me is a powerful response because what does it do? It enables me to write in English wholeheartedly. And in A Man of Two Faces, I talk about this. I embraced English wholeheartedly, but I could not tell whether it was my mother tongue or my native tongue. And because I embraced it wholeheartedly, I became an American. I wrote all these books. But with every step I took further into the English language, the further I was removed from my parents, as you're describing. That's the pain of our existence as colonized people or as displaced people or as exilic people. And that's powerful and tragic, and it also gives us the possibilities of creating new cultures and new ideas. And so in the end, for better and for worse, yes, I write in English. It's an act of salvation and destruction. But one of the best compliments I ever got was from a Vietnamese person who said they read The Sympathizer. It's all written in English. But they said, I can hear the rhythms of Vietnamese in the English. And I think it's because I grew up in these two languages, right? So in fact, I think when I wrote The Sympathizer, I was very aware that I could see the language from the inside and the outside. How many native speakers of a language can claim that? So yes, if we are inauthentic, if we have been displaced from language, it's tragic and uncomfortable, but it's also powerful and an opportunity as well.
Viet, we have an online question. Can I ask that? Thank you to all of the people that are part of the online audience. This is from Australia. Claire asks, Viet, how did you find making the series? I watched it first, then read the book, and the book was emotionally powerful, and the series had a tone almost of comedy. How did you find watching it?
I'm way too close to the series to really answer that very well. I think I think that it's a good series. Okay, I mean, I think I'm very proud of everybody who worked on it, who put all their effort into it. Whether it's great, I have no idea. But that's the nature of the collaboration, and it was very important to pick all the various different collaborators that I could to make sure that the TV series kind of came close to the novel. But you know, that's the danger and the opportunity of working with some place like Hollywood. There's so many resources, so much money, if you're lucky in some ways. But that also means that you have to collaborate. You have to work with others at the same time. I don't know if it's good or bad, but I remember, for example, we talk about the history of the Vietnam War, for example. You know, the first American artists to respond to the Vietnam War were the poets. And why was that? It's because poetry costs nothing except a poet's life. And who cares about that? You know, it's worth nothing, you know. But a Hollywood movie costs tens of millions of dollars, or a TV series. And when you have that much money, it's extremely slow to turn that aircraft carrier around. And that's why movies, I think, were the last to respond to the Vietnam War. And so that's where we arrive with the answer to the question from Australia. It's again, this complication of working within the belly of the beast. You have to make your choices, you have to make your compromises with the collaboration, with the acknowledgement that it's this kind of industry that has this much money that can then ensure that that story is broadcast even to Australia.
As a refugee, what is the most meaningful, valuable, or precious thing you think you gained, and the most meaningful, precious, or valuable thing you think you lost?
Well, I think the most precious, valuable thing I lost was the sense of a whole family. You know, leaving my adopted sister behind. That haunted me as an absent presence in my family, and in my life, and that shaped me. You know, knowing, for example, when I left Vietnam at 4 years of age, I knew I had a sister, obviously, but by 10 or 11, I forgot. And so then when a letter showed up in the mail around that time, with this picture of this young woman in it, beautiful young woman, I asked my parents, "Who is that?" And they said, "Your sister." It's like, I have a sister? And that was, again, this marker that inaugurated me into the sense that our refugee lives were marked by ghosts, by absent presences, and that I would have to try to confront that in some way. What has been powerful about being a refugee? What has been powerful about being a refugee is to embrace being a refugee. And this is an invitation extended to all refugees that many refugees refuse. But many refugees will not call themselves refugees. They'll call themselves immigrants instead, deliberately or accidentally. But I think the undercurrent is it's better to be an immigrant than a refugee. And I'm saying refugees and immigrants are quite different. Refugees exist because we're forced to move for some reason. We don't necessarily choose where we end up. We have gone through conditions of extreme danger and deprivation. There's not a refugee I know who does not have similar stories to what I've described, which is why I don't want to make any exceptional claims. I'm not exceptional. In fact, my experiences are not that bad. You know, most refugees have been through harrowing experiences. So then what happens when you survive? You have a choice. You can choose to just assimilate completely, become an American in this case, and then, 2017, I'll give you an example. Trump tries to close the border, separates children from their parents and so on. Vietnamese refugees are asked, what do you think of these Trumpian policies? And Vietnamese refugees have said, we're the good refugees. Those are the bad refugees. That's the choice, right? There's that temptation that once you've made it inside, you're on the outside. Once you've made it inside, close the door behind you. Pull up the ladder. Whether it's a refugee coming into a country, whether it's someone who has climbed the ladder of prestige and privilege. And so that's what I've taken away from being a refugee, my embrace of my own otherness, my willingness not to think of myself uniquely as a victim, but to empathize with other victims. And to realize that my stories are not about trying to rescue Vietnamese people, by trying to build solidarity and empathy and the recognition of the humanity of others, the very ones who are being demonized in the present. That's what I've taken away from being a refugee.
Thank you for coming to Spokane and speaking with us. One thing that I kept thinking about through your lecture was the through line that you mentioned about recurring patterns of colonialism and violence. And it reminded me of the idea that those who don't study history are doomed to repeat it. And so my question is, as a scholar of history, how do you maintain hope in a time when academic institutions are coming under attack and history itself is being increasingly challenged or rewritten, making it harder for us to learn about the past?
Great question. You're speaking to a bitter, disillusioned, middle-aged man, so wrong person to ask about hope. I don't know. I mean, are you an academic? Are you like a... I'm
a former history teacher.
Former history teacher, okay. When I was young, and I was in college, and I had to try to figure out, I'm not going to become a lawyer, I'm not going to become a doctor, what am I going to do? I heard about this great thing called tenure. I don't know how many of you know this thing. I was 21, I was like, oh my God, tenure. You get hired at a university, and you get tenure, you never get fired? I want that. So academia was my day job, but it was also my life as well. I've devoted 3 decades of my life to this, and I really believe in it. I believe in the causes of seeking truth and knowledge and all of this. And then I think what the last couple of years have revealed from October 7th onwards and the suppression of student protests against genocide, how the universities have reacted to it, how the Democratic and Republican administrations have reacted to that, and how university leadership has responded to political pressures, has revealed the hollowness of academia. And that's just a symptom of the rest of our country. Academia professes to teach all these wonderful ideals. I don't have to rehearse them here, right? And says, we're going to train you students to believe in all these wonderful ideas. And then the institutions of academia completely collapsed, not willing to stand up for these ideals, not willing to stand up for their students. What I take away from that is that we as human beings have the capacity to create noble institutions. And what makes them noble is still valid, still true. That gives me hope. But we as human beings screw up everything we do. That's our responsibility, that we've hollowed out our institutions, that we're cynical, that we don't have the courage to live up to what it is that we tell our students to believe in. But it's important to be realistic about that so we know what to do, how to reform the institution, how to use the institutions like academia to try to make change. And I think that struggle still exists. But what truly gives me hope is the fact that the students were willing to go out there. They are young, they have no power, they have no privilege, they have nothing except their convictions, their ideals, and their bodies. And they built those encampments. And here at the University of Washington and at Columbia University, just in the last couple of days, they've done it again. They've put everybody to shame. All of the adults, all of their leaders, all of the presidents who have not been willing to even say the word genocide. I take hope in that's what the students can do. I remember when I was a student at Berkeley, I graduated with 2 majors, 3 degrees, and 4 misdemeanors. Okay? I tried my best. I believed in what these students now believe. And I hope that if I was a student now, I would do what I did back then. Back then, I felt a little bit of shame because the previous cohort of Berkeley students was protesting against apartheid in South Africa. My cohort in the 1990s was protesting for greater curricular diversity and faculty diversity. Doesn't sound very awe-inspiring, right? But those were the days of the culture wars. And lo and behold, the culture wars are back with even greater force and ferocity, which goes to show that, in fact, we're still living through this long line of history, from the very origins of our country, how to interpret it, what that means, who gets to speak, who is taught. That was the battle of the 1980s and the 1990s domestically, and it is now at the front line, except it's articulated through this idea, this weaponized idea of anti-Semitism. And the students understand that at a very visceral level. So I hope that provides hope, that example of courage would inspire and shame all of us into taking action as well.
In the passage you read from the Sympathizer, you talked about this absurd notion of conflating and flattening all these different Vietnamese tribes with this single term. I'm wondering, obviously Asia is a much broader concept. I'm wondering, like, to what degree do you find the concept of being Asian American or being Asian a useful term, or to what degree is it similarly flattening or absurd or insulting?
You are such an intelligent audience. Come on, give me a break. These are challenging. These are challenging questions, and maybe we'll end there, right? I think we're about to run out of time. Wow, that question goes to the very heart of my being, because I grew up as this Vietnamese refugee kid, and my parents did not consider themselves Asian or American. When they said Americans, they meant other people. And when they talked about themselves, they said Vietnamese. And if they had any broader concept, they said Oriental. They actually had a business called the Oriental Funding Corporation at one point. And I was like, I felt queasiness when I saw that. I was like, I don't know what's wrong, but it just doesn't sound right. It sounds old-fashioned, Oriental, And then I got to Berkeley, and like I said, got immediately radicalized as an Asian American, learned that term for the first time in 1990, I think, took classes in Asian American history, Asian American literature, was enraged. Like, how come no one told me about the internment or the railroad, or the Philippine-American War, or the Korean War, all these kinds of things that have shaped us as Asian Americans in the United States. How come no one told us about 1968 and the Third World Liberation Front, and these young students at UCLA and Berkeley and San Francisco State who coined the term Asian American in 1968? And like that's a radical move. Because it's radical because in Asia, Asians hate each other, right? But here, they realize everybody else hates us more, so we have to band together as Asians and call ourselves Asian Americans, right? So Japanese, Chinese, Koreans, Filipinos can all get along. And then we expand that further into, Southeast Asians, Vietnamese, Lao, Cambodians. And then we expand that further into South Asians. So we say Indians and Bangladeshis and Pakistanis and so on, not including Kash Patel, not including Dinesh D'Souza, not including Usha Vance, okay? That's true. So it's an expansive notion, but like you said, it's incoherent. Because Asia is gigantic. It's gigantic, right? It goes all the way from, I think, like Malaysia and Indonesia on one side, all the way. If you talk about Asia, West Asia, Southwest Asia, you get to Israel and Palestine and what we have traditionally called the Far East and the Middle East and the Near East. It's incoherent. So what does that mean? It means that in the United States, our very notions of race are incoherent. They're obviously fictions. There's no such thing as an Asian American. We just made it up. At the same time, though, it's a political reality. We made it up because we have to respond to the political reality of racism. And so it doesn't matter if it's a social construct, we have to have it. But we're trapped inside of the contradiction. And that is the very definition of what it means to be a racial minority in the United States. It doesn't matter whether you're black or Asian or Latino or whatever. All these categories are absurd, but we have to take them. Ralph Ellison described the condition of black people in the United States as Kafkaesque. It's surreal to be a racial minority in the United States. It's surreal because on the one hand, we live in a country that says democracy, equality, opportunity, everyone's the same. And we live in a country that is built upon racism. That's the absurdity and the surreality. So there is no easy resolution to your question. We can't go around saying, well, being Asian is just too incoherent to have any meaning, therefore we shouldn't have this notion of being Asian or Asian American. But in fact, being Asian American, as surreal, absurd, and incoherent as it is, has given Asian Americans the opportunity to make political and cultural claims on this country. To such an extent that now, I talk to the younger generation of Asian Americans and I say, God, look at you. You have BTS and boba. It's great. We've made it. People actually want to go to Korea and marry Korean people. That wouldn't even have happened 50 years ago, right, for non-Koreans. We're romanticized, we're fetishized, awesome. But the contradictions mount. The contradictions mount, right? Because now Asian Americans who were once so excluded seem to be so included, right? We're 50% of the University of California population, 20 or 30% of the elite Northeastern colleges. We have Asian Americans at the highest levels of the government, for better and for worse. So what does it mean to want to be included in this country? What does it mean? Is representation matters enough? Is it enough to say we want more Asian American faces in higher places? And I say it's not enough. Because what was the project of 1968 and those young, radical, idealistic Asian American college students? They weren't talking about representation or inclusion. They were talking about, anti-imperialism, anti-racism, anti-war, anti-capitalism. And now the mainstream of Asian America is like, well, we want to go to Harvard and get a job with Goldman Sachs. But I take heart from the fact that those students back then in 1968 were a minority of this larger demographic category called Asian American, or not even called Asian American at that point. And those radical Asians are still a minority today, with Asians for Collective Liberation here in Spokane, okay? So, and this is, I talk about all this stuff in To Save and to Destroy. What it means is that to be minor in this country is different than being a minority. There's so many minorities in this country, and those are just demographic categories. But to be minor, to embrace being Asian American in a radical way, is to be oppositional to power, to inequality, to injustice. To hold this country up to the very promises that it made to its immigrants, to its refugees, to its countries that it sent its troops to say, we're going to bring you the American dream. Well, if that's true, then live up to it. That's what being Asian American means. Thank you so much, Spokane. You've been fantastic. I believe I'm signing books now. Yes? All right, I'll see you in the signing line.
Thank you, everybody, for your great questions. That was awesome. Viet, you are amazing. Thank you. Another round of applause, please, for our esteemed author. And before we start signing books here, I'm going to introduce Francis Mortel with ACL Spokane. Absolutely amazing human being, and please, a huge round of applause. This took so much work for this month to come together.
Yeah, I'm just really here to announce the best part, aside from Viet, is the raffle, the winners of the books. So we have 10 books to give away. If you already bought, then you got 2 and more. So I'm gonna call your name, and then you can claim it by the table. It's already signed, but at least you get